Airport security detained the elderly gardener. Then a Secret Service agent made a single call. The fluorescent lights of Terminal C buzzed overhead as 3 TSA officers formed a tight circle around the weathered man in work boots. Travelers hurried past, stealing glances at the commotion near Security Checkpoint Alpha. The elderly man stood perfectly still, his calloused hands at his sides, while Officer Marcus Webb rifled through a worn canvas duffel bag. "Sir, I'm going to need you to explain this," Webb said, his voice carrying across the terminal as he held up a gleaming military insignia that caught the harsh airport lighting. The man's gray eyes remained steady. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an authority that made the officers pause. "Call Agent Monroe. Tell her Silas Creighton is here. She'll understand." Webb scoffed. "Agent who?" "Look, Grandpa, I don't know what game you're playing, but Agent Odessa Monroe, Secret Service, Domestic Counter-Threat Division." Each word was measured, precise. "Tell her Hawthorne needs to catch a flight." The mention of that name would change everything. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back 3 hours earlier, to a quiet estate in the Virginia countryside where this story truly begins. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Fairfax County as Silas Creighton knelt among the rose bushes behind the Whitmore estate. At 78, his joints protested the early morning chill, but his hands moved with practiced precision as he pruned the climbing roses that had been his pride for the past 15 years. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore watched from her kitchen window, sipping her coffee as she did every morning. She'd grown fond of the quiet man who'd transformed her gardens from overgrown wilderness into something that belonged in southern living. Silas never spoke much, just "Morning, ma'am," when he arrived, and "See you tomorrow" when he left. She knew almost nothing about his past, except that he'd answered her gardener advertisement in 2009 with impeccable references and hands that knew their way around more than just soil. What she didn't know was that those same hands had once disarmed a bomb in Belgrade, strangled a KGB operative in Prague, and shaken hands with 3 different presidents in rooms that officially didn't exist. Silas stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. Today was different. Today, after 15 years of peaceful anonymity, he had somewhere to be. Inside his small apartment above the estate's carriage house, Silas pulled out a leather suitcase that hadn't seen daylight since the Clinton administration. From beneath loose floorboards, a habit that never died, he retrieved items that would seem ordinary to most people, but told the story of a life lived in shadows. A brass compass that had guided him through the mountains of Afghanistan in 1979. A silver dollar with an almost imperceptible scratch. A recognition token from an operation in Moscow that never made the history books. And wrapped in faded velvet, a Congressional Medal of Freedom that he'd never worn in public, presented in a ceremony attended by exactly 4 people. He packed these carefully in his canvas duffel, the same bag that had traveled with him from Saigon to Berlin to Belfast. Tomorrow he'd return to his roses. Today the past was calling. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, bearing the seal of the Central Intelligence Agency. After decades of silence, they wanted to honor the last surviving members of Operation Nightfall, a mission so classified that most of the participants had taken its secrets to their graves. The ceremony would be small, private, and long overdue. Silas had almost declined. Recognition wasn't why he'd served, but the letter mentioned others would be there, old ghosts he'd thought were long buried. And frankly, at 78, he wasn't sure how many more chances he'd have to see them. He dressed in his usual uniform, pressed khakis, a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, and work boots that had walked through more countries than most people could name. To anyone watching, he looked exactly like what he'd been for 15 years, a gardener heading to the airport for a family visit. The taxi driver who picked him up chatted about the weather and traffic. Silas nodded politely, his mind already shifting into the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through 30 years of operations that never officially happened. Old habits died hard, and in his experience they died badly. Reagan National Airport thrummed with its usual chaos. Silas moved through the crowds like water, present but unremarkable, a skill he'd mastered long before it became necessary for Survival. He'd learned decades ago that the most dangerous place to hide was in plain sight, and airports were perfect for disappearing into the background noise of American life. At the security checkpoint, he placed his duffel in the gray bin and stepped through the metal detector without incident. It was what happened next that changed everything. Officer Marcus Webb was having a routine Tuesday morning until he opened Silas Creighton's bag. Webb was young, eager, and had been with TSA for just over 2 years. He'd seen strange things: exotic foods, odd electronics, questionable souvenirs. But the collection in this particular bag made him pause. The military insignia was the first red flag. It wasn't something you'd find in a gift shop. This was clearly official, with engravings that spoke of actual service. But it was the other items that raised his suspicions. The compass looked military grade. The silver dollar had an odd weight to it, and there was something about the way everything was packed with almost surgical precision. "Sir, can you step aside, please?" Webb's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been trained to spot threats. Silas complied without argument, his hands visible, his demeanor calm. This wasn't his first time being questioned by security, though it had been a while. "Officer." Sarah Chen joined Webb, drawn by the commotion. She was senior staff, 10 years with TSA, and something about the situation felt off to her. Not dangerous. The old man seemed about as threatening as someone's grandfather, but definitely unusual. "What's the nature of your travel today, sir?" Chen asked. "Business meeting in Langley," Silas replied simply. Webb snorted. What kind of business does a gardener have in Langley? The question hung in the air. Silas could have explained. The invitation in his jacket pocket would have cleared things up quickly. But something in Webb's tone, the casual dismissal, triggered an older instinct. These were the moments when covers held or broke, when training separated the living from the dead. "The kind that requires a phone call," Silas said quietly. Chen decided to run his ID, standard procedure for anything unusual, and this situation definitely qualified as unusual. She swiped Silas's driver's license and watched her screen populate with basic information. Silas Creighton, age 78, Fairfax County address, clean driving record. Then the screen went red. Not the usual yellow for secondary screening or the orange for additional questions. Red. The kind of red that meant someone with higher clearance needed to get involved immediately. A message flashed. Classified reference. Level 4. Clearance required. Do not proceed without authorization. Chen had never seen anything like it. In 10 years of running IDs, she'd encountered plenty of alerts, outstanding warrants, no-fly lists, expired documents, but never something that locked her completely out of the system. "Webb, get Supervisor Martinez over here." Now, Elena Martinez had been with TSA since before it was TSA, back when airport security was handled by private companies and threats seemed simpler. She'd worked through 9/11, through the shoe bomber, through every evolution of aviation security in the modern era. She'd seen alerts that made her nervous, but she'd never seen one that made her curious. "What do you have, Chen?" ID came back classified. "System won't let me proceed." Martinez looked at Silas, who stood patiently with his hands clasped behind his back. He looked like every other senior citizen she'd processed that week. Tired, slightly rumpled, vaguely annoyed at the inconvenience. But there was something in his posture that reminded her of her father, a Marine who'd served in Korea and never quite lost that military bearing. "Sir, I'm going to need to make some phone calls. Are you comfortable waiting in our office?" "I'd prefer to remain here," Silas replied. "But I do need you to make one specific call." Martinez raised an eyebrow. In 15 years, she'd never had a passenger request a specific call. "Agent Odessa Monroe, Secret Service Domestic Counter-Threat Division. Tell her Silas Creighton is here and that Hawthorne needs to catch a flight." The name hit Martinez like a physical blow. Not Silas Creighton. That meant nothing to her, but Hawthorne. She'd heard that name exactly once, in a classified briefing she'd attended 5 years ago about potential domestic threats. It had been mentioned in passing, in a context that suggested respect rather than concern. Webb was growing impatient. Ma'am, shouldn't we just deny him boarding? I mean, look at him. What's a gardener doing with military gear anyway? Martinez held up a hand for silence. She was already reaching for the secure phone that connected directly to federal law enforcement. Some instincts couldn't be taught, and right now every instinct she'd developed over decades of security work was telling her that Silas Creighton was exactly who he claimed to be. 200 miles away in Washington, D.C., Agent Odessa Monroe was having the kind of morning that made her question her career choices. 3 briefings before 10 a.m., a budget meeting at lunch, and a stack of threat assessments that would keep her reading until midnight. At 46, she'd spent 2 decades with the Secret Service, working her way up from field agent to supervising the Domestic Counter-Threat Division, a job that paid well but came with the kind of stress that turned hair gray and kept psychologists in business. She was reviewing intelligence reports when her secure line rang, the red phone that only rang for genuine emergencies or communications from other federal agencies. Monroe. Agent Monroe, this is Supervisor Martinez, TSA, Reagan, National. I have a gentleman here who specifically requested I call you. Name is Silas Creighton. He said to tell you that Hawthorne needs to catch a flight. Monroe's coffee mug hit her desk hard enough to splash coffee across her morning briefings. In 20 years of federal service, she'd heard the name Hawthorne exactly 3 times. Once in her initial security briefing when she'd joined the service, once in a classified seminar about Cold War assets, and once from her mentor, Deputy Director James Crawford, who told her that if she ever heard that particular name in an operational context, she should drop everything and pay attention. Where is he now? Security checkpoint, Terminal C. People flagged his ID and got a classified reference. He's been very cooperative, but he seems... I don't know how to explain it, ma'am. He seems like he's used to this kind of situation. Monroe was already reaching for her jacket.
Supervisor Martinez, I need you to listen very carefully. Mr. Creighton is not to be detained, questioned, or processed further. Put eyes on him, keep him comfortable, but do not let him out of your sight. I'm en route. Ma'am, should I... No.
Questions? No searches? No procedures? Treat him like he's someone very important because he is. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Monroe hung up and immediately dialed another number. If Hawthorne was surfacing after decades underground, there were people who needed to know. Crawford. Jim, it's Odessa. Hawthorne just showed up at Reagan National. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for Monroe to wonder if the call had dropped. Are you certain? TSA has him at security. He requested me by name. Jesus Christ. Crawford's voice carried a weight that Monroe had rarely heard from her old mentor. Odessa, do you remember that conversation we had about legends? She did. Crawford had told her once that every agency had stories about operators who'd become myths, people whose actual accomplishments were so classified that they'd become folklore whispered in secure briefings and retirement parties. Hawthorne isn't folklore, is he? No. He's very real, and if he's coming out of retirement, something significant is happening. I'm making some calls. You get to him and you keep him safe until I can sort out what's going on. Monroe was already in the elevator, heading for the parking garage. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Hawthorne's file was so classified she'd never seen it, but the references she'd encountered painted a picture of someone who'd operated in the darkest corners of the Cold War. If he was surfacing now, at his age, it wasn't for a social call. She made one more call as she navigated D.C. traffic with the kind of urgency that made her grateful for federal plates and emergency credentials. This is Agent Monroe, requesting immediate diplomatic transport to Reagan National Terminal C Priority 1 authorization, and I need a full tactical team on standby. The drive to Reagan National took 18 minutes, a minor miracle in D.C. traffic that Monroe attributed to luck and the kind of aggressive driving that would have earned civilians hefty tickets. She spent the entire drive thinking about the one detail in Hawthorne's limited file that had stuck with her. The note that he'd walked away from active service at the height of his effectiveness, disappearing into civilian life so completely that even the agency had lost track of him. People like that didn't surface accidentally. They surfaced because they had to. The black Suburban pulled up to Terminal C with the kind of precision that suggested its occupants were familiar with emergency protocols. Monroe stepped out, followed by two agents who'd been briefed to expect unusual circumstances, but not told what those circumstances might be. Inside the terminal, the scene at Security Checkpoint Alpha had drawn a small crowd. Not the panicked crowd that formed around genuine threats, but the curious crowd that gathered when something interesting happened. Travelers paused in their rushed journeys to glance at the elderly man standing calmly beside three increasingly nervous TSA officers. Silas saw Monroe the moment she entered the terminal. She moved like federal law enforcement, purposeful, alert, comfortable with authority. But it was the way she approached that told him everything he needed to know about how much the world had changed since his retirement. She walked directly to him, ignoring the TSA officers, and stopped 3 feet away. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the elderly gardener in work clothes and the federal agent in a perfectly pressed suit. Then Monroe did something that shocked everyone watching, including her own agents. She came to attention and offered a precise military salute. "Mr. Creighton, it's an honor to meet you, sir." The murmur that went through the crowd was audible. TSA Supervisor Martinez felt her face flush with embarrassment as she realized she'd been treating someone of obvious importance like a potential security threat. Officer Webb looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Silas returned the salute with the kind of precision that suggested muscle memory, older than most of the people watching. "Agent Monroe, thank you for coming." "Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced. If you're ready, I have transportation waiting." "That's kind of you, but I have a ticket on the 2:15 to Richmond. I'd prefer to use it." Monroe studied his face, looking for some indication of whether this was preference or operational necessity. "Sir, are you certain that's the most secure option?" Silas smiled, the first time anyone had seen him smile since the morning began. "Agent Monroe, I've been flying commercial for 15 years. I think I can manage one more flight." Martinez stepped forward, her face red with embarrassment and concern. "Mr. Creighton, I want to apologize for how you were treated." "If I'd known, you did exactly what you were trained to do," Silas interrupted gently. "Your people were professional and thorough. No apology necessary." But Officer Webb, the young man who'd made the jokes about grandpas and cosplay conventions, looked like he might be sick. Monroe noticed his distress and made a mental note to have a conversation with TSA leadership about briefing protocols. "Sir," Webb stammered, "I'm really sorry about the things I said. I didn't know." Silas turned to him with the same gentle smile he'd given Martinez. "Son, how could you have known? We all miss things right in front of us sometimes. The important thing is recognizing it when it happens." Monroe watched the interaction with growing respect. She'd read enough classified files to know that true professionals, the ones who survived long careers in dangerous work, were often the kindest people you'd ever meet. Violence was a tool, not a personality trait. "Mr. Creighton, if you're determined to fly commercial, I'd like to arrange an escort. That won't be necessary, but I would appreciate having my belongings returned." Martinez practically sprinted to retrieve the duffel bag, handling it now like it contained priceless artifacts. Which, Monroe realized, it probably did. As Silas shouldered his bag, Monroe made a decision that she'd spend the next several hours explaining to her superiors. "Sir, I know this isn't protocol, but would you mind if I asked you a question?" Silas paused. "I may not answer it, but you're welcome to ask. How long has it been since you've been back?" "Officially, I was never there in the first place." The answer came with the kind of smile that suggested shared knowledge between professionals. "Unofficially, this will be my first time in Langley since 1994. Monroe nodded. That explained the ceremony invitation she'd heard whispers about, the one honoring Cold War assets who'd served in operations that were only now being acknowledged. "Sir, it's been an honor meeting you. If you ever need anything..." "Agent Monroe, you've done more than enough. But I will say this. You remind me of some very good people I once worked with. Keep being curious, it's a rare quality in this business." With that, Silas Creighton picked up his boarding pass and walked toward his gate, looking for all the world like any other elderly traveler heading home from a business trip. The crowd dispersed, TSA returned to normal operations, and Monroe stood watching until he disappeared around a corner. Her phone buzzed with a text from Deputy Director Crawford. "Everything secure?" She typed back, "Secure, and we just met a legend." Silas's flight to Richmond was mercifully uneventful. He'd chosen a window seat near the back of the plane, partly out of habit. Exits were easier to reach from the rear, and partly because he genuinely enjoyed watching the landscape pass below. From 30,000 feet, Virginia looked peaceful, green, and blissfully free of the complications that had defined most of his adult life. The passenger next to him was a young woman working on her laptop, completely absorbed in what appeared to be a business presentation. She glanced at him once when he sat down, offered a polite smile, and returned to her work. To her, he was just another senior citizen heading home. The kind of forgettable encounter that made up most of commercial aviation. If she'd known that the quiet man beside her had once spent 6 months undercover in Prague, feeding intelligence that helped end the Cold War a decade early, she might have been more interested in conversation. If she'd known that he'd saved the life of a president who couldn't acknowledge it publicly, she might have put down her laptop entirely. But Silas preferred it this way. Anonymity was its own kind of freedom. As the plane began its descent into Richmond, he pulled out his phone and composed a brief text to Mrs. Whitmore. "Flight delayed, but heading home. We'll be back to work on the roses tomorrow morning." It wasn't entirely true. His flight hadn't been delayed, but it was the kind of small fiction that made civilian life simpler. Some secrets were worth keeping, even the harmless ones. The ceremony at Langley had been everything he'd expected and nothing he'd wanted. 3 hours of speeches about service and sacrifice, delivered to an audience of 30 people who understood exactly what those words meant. He'd seen faces he'd thought were buried alongside their operations, shaken hands with men who'd aged into different people entirely, and accepted recognition for work that would remain classified until long after all of them were gone. The highlight had been seeing Robert "Tank" Morrison, his partner from the Belgrade operation, now retired to a farm in Montana where he raised horses and taught his grandchildren to fish. They'd spent 20 minutes catching up on 40 years of intentionally ordinary life, trading stories about gardens and livestock with the same enthusiasm they'd once reserved for exit strategies and emergency protocols. "You ever miss it?" Tank had asked as the ceremony wound down. Silas had considered the question seriously. "I miss some of the people. I don't miss wondering if I'd wake up in the morning." "Fair enough, you always were the philosophical one." Now, watching Virginia farmland scroll past beneath the aircraft, Silas reflected on the day's events. The ceremony had been important, not for the recognition, but for the closure. The young TSA officer's embarrassment had been unnecessary but touching. Agent Monroe's respect had been professional and genuine, but it was the roses waiting for him in Fairfax County that held his attention. Tomorrow, he'd be back to work before sunrise, tending plants that grew predictably, and problems that could be solved with water, fertilizer, and patience. After 30 years of geopolitical chaos, it was exactly the life he'd chosen. The plane touched down smoothly, and Silas gathered his belongings with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. The duffel bag felt lighter somehow, as if acknowledging his past had made it easier to carry. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore was sipping her morning coffee and watching for Silas when she noticed the black sedan parked at the end of her driveway. It wasn't unusual for the estate to receive deliveries or service calls, but something about this particular car made her pause. It looked official in a way that suggested government rather than commerce. She was still watching when Silas arrived, for work, exactly on time as he had been every morning for 15 years. He walked past the sedan without apparent concern, nodded to Mrs. Whitmore through the kitchen window, and headed directly to his gardening shed. 20 minutes later, a woman in a dark suit approached the kitchen door. Mrs. Whitmore opened it, to find Agent Monroe, though she didn't know that yet. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Agent Monroe with the Secret Service. I wanted to speak with you about your gardener, Mr. Creighton." Mrs. Whitmore's first thought was that Silas was in some kind of trouble. Her second thought was that this might explain why he'd always seemed like more than just a gardener. Is Silas all right? Has something happened? Ma'am, Mr. Creighton is fine. I actually wanted to discuss his employment with you if you have a few minutes. They sat at Mrs. Whitmore's kitchen table, the same table where she'd interviewed Silas 15 years earlier. Monroe was professional but warm, asking questions about his work habits, his interactions with visitors, his general demeanor. Nothing threatening but clearly thorough. Agent Monroe, if you don't mind me asking, why are you interested in my gardener? Monroe had spent the drive from D.C. thinking about how to answer that question. The truth was classified, but Mrs. Whitmore deserved some explanation. Ma'am, Mr. Creighton has a background in government service. Very distinguished service. We're conducting a routine security review, and I wanted to ensure there were no concerns with his current situation. Government. Service? Mrs. Whitmore looked out her kitchen window, where Silas was methodically pruning the climbing roses he'd planted her first year of employment. What kind of government service? I'm afraid I can't discuss specifics, but I can tell you that he served his country with exceptional distinction for many years. Mrs. Whitmore digested this information slowly. It explained some things: the way Silas moved with unconscious precision, the fact that he'd never seemed intimidated by anything, the occasional moments when she'd caught him scanning the horizon like he was looking for something specific. He's been the best employee I've ever had, she said finally. Reliable, honest, skilled. Whatever he did before, he's been nothing but a gentleman here. Monroe smiled. That's exactly what I expected to hear. Outside, Silas was aware of the conversation taking place in the kitchen, just as he'd been aware of Monroe's arrival. Old habits. He'd noticed the sedan before Mrs. Whitmore had, identified Monroe as federal law enforcement before she'd gotten out of her car, and positioned himself where he could observe the interaction without appearing to do so. It was unnecessary paranoia by any reasonable standard, but reasonable standards hadn't kept him alive for 30 years of classified operations. When Monroe emerged from the house, she walked directly to where Silas was working. Mr. Creighton, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to ensure your situation here was secure. Silas straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. Routine follow-up? Something like that. Mrs. Whitmore speaks very highly of you. She's been a good employer. I'd prefer to keep things that way. Monroe understood. He was asking for continued anonymity, the kind of professional courtesy that let retired assets live normal lives. Sir, as far as the service is concerned, you're exactly what you appear to be, a skilled gardener living a quiet life in Virginia. We have no interest in changing that. Silas nodded. I appreciate that, Agent Monroe, and I appreciate your handling of yesterday's situation. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, do you ever regret walking away? It was a personal question, possibly inappropriate, but Silas seemed to consider it seriously. Agent Monroe, I spent 30 years in rooms where the wrong decision could start wars or end them. I've been responsible for intelligence that saved lives and operations that cost them. These roses bloom every year, exactly when they're supposed to, and the only lives at stake are aphids. He gestured to the garden around them, acres of carefully tended plants that represented 15 years of peaceful, predictable work. I've never been happier. Monroe left with the kind of respect reserved for people who'd earned the right to their choices. As her sedan pulled away, Silas returned to his pruning, already mentally planning his afternoon work on the vegetable garden. Officer. Miles Webb couldn't concentrate on his work. 3 days had passed since the incident with Silas Creighton, and he'd spent most of that time replaying every moment of the encounter. The jokes he'd made, the assumptions he'd drawn, the complete failure to recognize that he was dealing with someone extraordinary. It wasn't the embarrassment that bothered him, though there was plenty of that. It was the realization that he'd let his preconceptions blind him to what should have been obvious signs. The way Creighton had stood, perfectly calm under pressure. The precision with which he'd packed his belongings. The respectful but firm way he'd requested the specific call. Webb had been with TSA for 2 years, and he'd always prided himself on being observant. But he'd missed everything that mattered about Silas Creighton because he'd seen work clothes and gray hair and assumed, Incompetence. You're still thinking about the gardener, Sarah Chen observed during their break. Yeah, I keep thinking about what else I might be missing. Chen had been thinking about it too. In 10 years with TSA, she'd developed a mental catalog of suspicious behaviors, threat indicators, and red flags. But she'd never considered that some of the most interesting people might be the ones who appeared most ordinary. You know what bothers me? She said. I ran his ID and got a classified reference, and my first thought was that it was some kind of mistake, like the system had glitched. Same here. I couldn't believe someone that normal could have that kind of background. Supervisor Martinez joined them, carrying the kind of tired expression that suggested she'd been having similar conversations with other staff members. You two aren't the only ones having second thoughts, she said. I've got 6 officers asking me how to spot the next Silas Creighton. It was a fair question. How do you identify someone whose entire skill set is based on not being identified? Maybe that's the wrong question, Chen suggested. Maybe the question is how we treat people when we can't immediately categorize them. Martinez nodded. She'd been thinking along similar lines. The Silas Creighton incident had highlighted something she'd been concerned about for years, the tendency to make snap judgments based on appearance and assumption. I'm scheduling additional training, she announced. Situational awareness, threat assessment, and professional courtesy. We need to get better at seeing what's actually in front of us. Webb looked up from his coffee. Ma'am, do you think there are others? I mean, people like Mr. Creighton? Martinez considered the question. In 15 years of airport security, she'd processed thousands of passengers. How many of them had stories she'd never imagined? How many had backgrounds that would surprise her? How many had she dismissed because they didn't fit her mental image of someone important? Officer Webb, I think the world is full of people like Mr. Creighton. The difference is that most of them don't need to make phone calls to prove it. News traveled fast in the federal law enforcement community, and the story of Hawthorne's airport encounter became one of those legends that gets told in secure briefings and retirement parties. The details varied depending on who was telling it, but the core elements remained consistent. An elderly man, mistaken identity, and a phone call that changed everything. Agent Monroe found herself telling the story more often than she'd expected. It became a useful teaching tool during training seminars about making assumptions and recognizing assets in unexpected circumstances. The point, she'd tell new agents, isn't that every senior citizen you meet is a retired Cold War operative. The point is that you can't tell someone's story by looking at them, and treating people with respect costs nothing. Deputy Director Crawford had a different perspective. He'd seen enough classified files to know that Hawthorne's story wasn't unique. There were dozens of retired assets living quiet lives across the country, their contributions to national security known only to a handful of people with appropriate clearances. It's a reminder, he told Monroe during one of their regular briefings, that some of our most important work is done by people who'll never be publicly recognized for it. The story also reached academic circles, though in heavily sanitized form. Professor Elizabeth Hartley at Georgetown University used it as a case study in her national security course, focusing on the challenges of maintaining operational security while transitioning to civilian life. The individual in question, she'd tell her students, represents a generation of public servants who worked in circumstances we can barely imagine, for purposes that remain classified decades later. The fact that they've been able to successfully integrate into normal society speaks to both their professionalism and their resilience. Her students, most of whom were in their early 20s, struggled to imagine their own grandparents having such hidden depths. It was a useful reminder that every generation faced challenges that seemed insurmountable at the time. 2 weeks after the airport incident, Silas was working in Mrs. Whitmore's vegetable garden when he noticed the approach of 3 men in suits. Not federal agents this time. Their approach was too casual, their clothes too expensive, but definitely official in some capacity. He continued working as they approached, his hands busy with tomato plants while his mind cataloged possible threats and responses. Old habits. Mr. Creighton? The lead man was in his 50s, gray-haired, with the kind of bearing that suggested military background. My name is Colonel David Harrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. I was hoping we could have a word. Silas straightened slowly, recognizing the type, if not the individual. Career intelligence officer, probably 10 years his junior, with the confidence that came from running operations rather than executing them. Colonel Harrison, what can I do for you? Sir, I wanted to discuss a proposition with you, a consulting opportunity. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Silas had been expecting this conversation for 2 weeks, ever since the airport. The incident had reminded half of Washington that Hawthorne was still alive and theoretically available. I'm retired, Colonel. I understand that, sir. But we have a situation that could benefit from your particular expertise. Nothing operational, strictly analytical. A few hours of your time compensated at consultant rates that I think you'd find attractive. Silas glanced toward the house where Mrs. Whitmore was visible through the kitchen window. She'd given him 15 years of peaceful employment, asking no questions about his past and expecting nothing more than professional gardening. She deserved better than having her property turned into a recruiting ground. Gentlemen, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested. If you need to discuss this further, you can reach me through official channels. Right now, I have work to finish. Colonel Harrison looked like he wanted to push the issue, but something in Silas's tone suggested that would be unwise. Sir, if you reconsider, you have my card. I won't reconsider, but thank you for thinking of me. After they left, Silas continued working in the garden, but his mind was elsewhere. The recruitment visit had been inevitable. Too many people now knew he was alive and active. There would be others, each with opportunities that sounded reasonable, and projects that needed his specific skill set. They were all missing the point. He hadn't retired because he was tired or injured or compromised. He'd retired because he was done. Done with rooms where decisions had global consequences. Done with operations where success was measured in lives saved or wars prevented. Done with the weight of secrets that could never be shared. The tomatoes he was tending would be ready for harvest in 6 weeks. Mrs. Whitmore planned to can them for winter, the same way she'd done for the past decade. It was the kind of predictable seasonal work that had replaced the chaos of his former life, and he had no intention of giving it up for any consulting opportunity, no matter how attractive the compensation. That evening, Silas called Agent Monroe. Agent Monroe, this is Silas Creighton. I wanted to give you a heads up that I received a recruitment visit today. Defense Intelligence Agency. Sir, are you concerned about operational security? Not concerned, just informing. I declined their offer, but I suspect there will be others. I'd prefer to keep my current situation stable. Monroe understood. Retired assets who surfaced often found themselves in demand, and not all recruitment efforts were as polite as Colonel Harrison's had been. Mr. Creighton, would you like me to put out some informal guidance? Let people know you're genuinely retired? I'd appreciate that, Agent Monroe. I've found my place here, and I'd like to keep it. After the call, Monroe spent 20 minutes composing a carefully worded message to her counterparts in other agencies. The essence was simple. Hawthorne was retired, happy, and not available for consultation. Anyone who approached him directly would be considered to be operating outside appropriate channels. It was an unusual step, but Monroe had learned to trust her instincts about people. Silas Creighton had earned the right to tend his gardens in peace. 6 months after the airport incident, freelance journalist David Kim received a tip about an unusual story involving TSA, the Secret Service, and someone described only as a gardener with a mysterious past. Kim specialized in human interest stories with unexpected angles, and this one seemed to have all the elements he looked for. His initial research hit immediate walls. Official sources were polite but unhelpful. The TSA incident report had been classified above his clearance level. The Secret Service declined to comment on operational matters. Even his contacts at local news stations had nothing useful. But Kim was persistent, and he eventually tracked down Officer Miles Webb, who had left TSA 3 months earlier to join the Park Police. Webb was reluctant to discuss the incident, but he was willing to talk about its impact on his approach to law enforcement. It changed how I see people, Webb explained during their interview. I realized I'd been making assumptions based on appearance, age, social class, All the things that have nothing to do with who someone actually is. Can you be more specific about what happened? Webb chose his words carefully. I encountered someone who taught me that extraordinary people often look perfectly ordinary. That's really all I can say about the specifics. Kim tried a different approach, reaching out to Mrs. Whitmore through her gardening club. She was even more circumspect than Webb had been. Mr. Creighton is a wonderful employee and a good man, she said when Kim called. I don't know anything about his background. Before he came to work for me, and I've never asked. Some people deserve their privacy. The more Kim investigated, the more convinced he became that he was onto something significant. But every lead ended the same way, with people who clearly knew more than they were willing to say, speaking in the kind of careful language that suggested legal or security constraints. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. His grandfather, a Korean War veteran who'd spent 40 years with the State Department. David, some stories aren't meant to be told, his grandfather said, after Kim described his research. And some people have earned the right to live quietly. Maybe this is one of those times when being a good journalist means walking away. Kim had never walked away from a story, but something in his grandfather's tone made him reconsider. That night he deleted his research files and moved on to other projects. 3 weeks later, he received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, an elderly man in work clothes, kneeling among rose bushes, completely absorbed in his work. On the back, someone had written, "Some heroes prefer gardens to headlines." Kim kept the photograph on his desk as a reminder that the best stories aren't always the ones that get told. 1 year after the airport incident, Mrs. Whitmore decided to throw a small garden party to celebrate the completion of her landscape renovation project. Silas had spent months designing and implementing a comprehensive update to her gardens, incorporating sustainable practices and native plants that would require minimal maintenance as they both grew older. The guest list was small, a few neighbors, her book club, some family members. She'd invited Silas, of course, though she suspected he'd decline. He wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, and he generally avoided social gatherings. To her surprise, he accepted. The party was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in late spring, when the gardens would be at their peak. Mrs. Whitmore had hired a caterer and arranged for tables to be set up on the terrace overlooking Silas's greatest achievement, a 3-acre garden that seamlessly blended formal landscaping with natural meadow areas. Silas arrived early, as was his habit, ostensibly to check on the automatic irrigation system, but actually to ensure everything looked perfect for Mrs. Whitmore's guests. He was adjusting a sprinkler head when he noticed a familiar black sedan pulling into the driveway. Agent Monroe stepped out, dressed casually in slacks and a blazer rather than her usual business suit. She looked around the gardens with obvious appreciation before spotting Silas. "Mr. Creighton, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Mrs. Whitmore invited me." Silas raised an eyebrow. "She invited you?" "I've been corresponding with her about garden design. Turns out we have a mutual interest in sustainable landscaping." It was a diplomatic answer that skirted the real reason for Monroe's presence. She'd made it her business to keep an informal eye on Silas. And when Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned the garden party during one of their conversations, Monroe had suggested that she'd love to see the gardens she'd heard so much about. "Agent Monroe, are you here professionally or personally?" "Personally, sir. I've heard a lot about your work here, and I was curious to see it for myself." Monroe spent the next 20 minutes getting a guided tour of the gardens, asking knowledgeable questions about plant selection, soil preparation, and water management. It was clear she knew more about horticulture than most federal agents, and Silas found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation. "You know, Agent Monroe, if you ever decide to leave federal service, you'd make a good landscape designer." "Thank you, sir. I've been thinking about what comes after government work. This is inspiring." As Mrs. Whitmore's other guests arrived, Silas retreated to his usual role as background observer. But Monroe noticed that several guests sought him out, asking questions about specific plants or requesting advice about their own gardens. He answered each question thoughtfully, clearly taking pleasure in sharing his knowledge. The high point of the afternoon came when Mrs. Whitmore asked Silas to say a few words about the garden renovation. He was clearly uncomfortable with public speaking, but he handled it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. Mrs. Whitmore gave me the opportunity to create something beautiful and lasting, he said, addressing the small crowd from the terrace. Gardens teach us patience, planning, and the importance of tending to things carefully over time. I'm grateful to have spent the last 15 years learning those lessons. The applause was genuine and sustained. Monroe noticed that several guests had tears in their eyes, though they probably couldn't have explained why. After the party wound down and the guests departed, Monroe helped Mrs. Whitmore with cleanup, while Silas checked the irrigation system one final time. "He's remarkable, isn't he?" Mrs. Whitmore said as they watched him work. "Yes, ma'am, he really is. I still don't know much about his background, but I know he's made my life better. Sometimes that's enough." Monroe nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. 2 years after the airport incident, Officer Miles Webb, now Sergeant Webb with the Park Police, was conducting a training session for new recruits when he decided to share a story. "How many of you think you're good at reading people?" he asked the class of 20-something law enforcement trainees. Most hands went up. Webb smiled. "I thought I was too. Let me tell you about the time I completely misjudged someone, and what it taught me about assumptions." He told them about Silas Crichton, though he used no names and provided no identifying details. He described his own preconceptions, his casual dismissal of an elderly man in work clothes, and the moment when everything changed. "The lesson isn't that you should assume everyone has a secret background," he concluded. "The lesson is that you should treat everyone with the same professional respect, regardless of how they look or what you think you know about them." One of the trainees raised her hand. "Sergeant Webb, how do you know when someone deserves that kind of respect?" "Officer Martinez, everyone deserves that kind of respect, that's the point." The training session ran long as the recruits peppered Webb with questions about situational awareness, threat assessment, and the challenge of balancing caution with courtesy. It was exactly the kind of discussion Webb had hoped to generate. After class, Officer Martinez, the trainee who'd asked the question, approached Webb privately. "Sergeant, I keep thinking about your story. Do you think that man knew you were underestimating him?" Webb considered the question. "Officer Martinez, I think he knew exactly what I was thinking from the moment I opened his bag. And I think he was disappointed but not surprised. That must have been a terrible feeling." "It was. But it was also educational. I learned more about being a police officer in those 10 minutes than I had in the previous 2 years. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think he forgave you?" "I think he understood that I was young and inexperienced, and that making mistakes is part of learning. But more importantly, I learned to forgive myself and do better." The conversation stayed with Martinez as she began her career in law enforcement. Months later, when she encountered her first situation involving someone who didn't fit obvious categories, a homeless veteran with extensive medical knowledge, a teenage hacker with surprising insights into cybersecurity, she remembered Webb's story and adjusted her approach accordingly. The ripple effects of that airport encounter continued to spread, one interaction at a time. 5 years after the airport incident, Mrs. Whitmore made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She donated her estate to the county, with the stipulation that the gardens be maintained as a public space and educational center. "I'm 83 years old," she explained to the county commissioners during the donation ceremony. "These gardens are too beautiful to be enjoyed by just one person, and too educational to be lost when I'm gone." The Whitmore Gardens opened to the public 6 months later, featuring guided tours, educational programs, and a small visitor center. Silas had mixed feelings about the change. He valued privacy and quiet, but he couldn't argue with Mrs. Whitmore's logic. "Will you stay on as head gardener?" she asked him during one of their final conversations as employer and employee. "If the county will have me," he replied. "These plants need consistency." The county was delighted to retain Silas's services, though they had no idea they were hiring someone whose previous employer had been the United States government. To them, He was simply the man who'd created some of the most beautiful and sustainable gardens in Virginia. The transition to public gardens changed Silas's daily routine considerably. Instead of working in solitude, he found himself interacting with visitors, school groups, and volunteer gardeners. It was an adjustment, but he discovered he enjoyed sharing his knowledge with people who genuinely wanted to learn. His favorite visitors were the children. They asked direct questions without hidden agendas, showed genuine excitement about plants and growing things, and had no preconceptions about what a gardener should look like or how he should act. Mr. Silas. One 8-year-old asked during a school tour, "How do you know so much about plants?" "Same way you learn anything important," he replied. "Pay attention, ask questions, and practice every day." "Did you always want to be a gardener?" Silas smiled. "No, I had a different job for a long time, but I always liked growing things even when I was doing other work." The child nodded solemnly as if this made perfect sense. Agent Monroe visited the public gardens twice a year, usually during the spring and fall when Silas's work was most visible. She'd take the guided tour like any other visitor, ask appropriate questions about sustainable gardening practices, and spend a few minutes in private conversation with Silas about how he was adjusting to the changes. "Any regrets about going public?" she asked during one visit. "Some days," Silas admitted. "But seeing kids get excited about plants, that's worth the occasional inconvenience." Monroe understood. After 30 years of classified work that would never be publicly acknowledged, there was something satisfying about creating something beautiful that could be shared with anyone who cared to look. 7 years after the airport incident, Silas received another official invitation, this one from the Virginia Horticultural Society. They wanted to present him with their Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to sustainable gardening and public education. Unlike the CIA ceremony that had started this story, this recognition would be public, well-attended, and focused on work he could discuss openly. Silas was ambivalent about accepting, but Mrs. Whitmore, now living in an assisted living facility but still sharp as ever, convinced him it was important. "Silas, you've spent your whole life serving others. First in whatever work you did before I met you, then taking care of my gardens, now teaching people at the public gardens. Let people say thank you." The ceremony was held at the Virginia State Capitol, with an audience of several hundred people including professional horticulturists, public officials, and many of the volunteers who worked at the Whitmore Gardens. Silas wore his best suit, purchased specifically for the occasion, and tried to look comfortable under the attention. The presenter, Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the TSA officer, spoke about Silas's innovative approaches to water conservation, his success in creating habitats for native wildlife, and his dedication to education and public service. "In an era when many people feel disconnected from the natural world," she said, "Silas Creighton has created spaces that remind us of our connection to the earth and our responsibility to care for it." When Silas stepped to the podium to accept the award, he looked out at an audience that included Agent Monroe, several TSA officers, including Miles Webb and Sarah Chen, Mrs. Whitmore in her wheelchair, and dozens of children who'd taken tours of the gardens. 30 years ago, he began, I was doing work that I couldn't talk about in places I couldn't mention, for reasons that had to remain secret. It was important work, and I was proud to do it. But it wasn't the kind of life that left much behind, for other people to see. He paused, gathering his thoughts. These gardens will be here long after I'm gone. The children who visit them will remember what they learned about taking care of growing things. The volunteers who work with me will carry those skills to their own communities. That's a different kind of service, but it's just as important as anything I did before. The applause was sustained and heartfelt. In the audience, Agent Monroe found herself wiping away tears, though she couldn't have explained exactly why. After the ceremony, there was a reception where Silas found himself surrounded by well-wishers and colleagues. For someone who'd spent most of his adult life avoiding attention, he handled it with remarkable grace. Miles Webb approached him during a quiet moment. "Mr. Creighton, I don't know if you remember me, but I was one of the TSA officers who—" "I remember you, Miles. You've done well for yourself." Webb was surprised that Silas remembered his name. "Sir, I wanted to thank you for how you handled that situation. You could have made it much worse for all of us. Miles, we all make mistakes when we're learning. The important thing is what we do afterward. I tell that story in my training classes now, about treating people with respect regardless of assumptions." Silas smiled. "That's a good lesson to teach." As the reception wound down, Silas found himself standing with Agent Monroe on the Capitol steps, looking out at the lights of Richmond. "Any regrets about coming out of retirement even briefly?" she asked. "Agent Monroe, I never came out of retirement. I just stopped hiding what I was retired from." "Is there a difference?" "All the difference in the world. I'm still the same person I was 8 years ago, someone who tends gardens and teaches people about growing things. The only thing that changed is that some people now know I used to do other work." Monroe nodded, understanding the distinction. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, do you think you'll ever tell the whole story?" Silas considered the question seriously. "Agent Monroe, the whole story isn't mine to tell. It belongs to a lot of people, most of whom are gone now. But the important parts, about service, about finding purpose, about the value of quiet work, those parts are already being told every day in those gardens." As they parted ways that evening, Monroe realized that Silas Creighton had achieved something remarkable. He'd found a way to honor his past while building a meaningful future, without compromising either one. 10 years after the airport incident, Silas Creighton was celebrating his 88th birthday with a small gathering at the Whitmore Gardens. His steps were slower now, and he relied on a walking stick for longer distances, but his mind remained sharp and his passion for gardening undiminished. The celebration was attended by an eclectic group: Agent Monroe, now retired from the Secret Service and working as a security consultant; Miles Webb, who'd been promoted to lieutenant with the Park Police; Mrs. Whitmore, now 93 and still formidable despite her reliance on a wheelchair; and dozens of volunteers, students, and friends who'd come to know Silas through his work at the gardens. The highlight of the afternoon was the dedication of a new section of the gardens, the Children's Discovery Area, designed specifically for educational programs. Silas had spent 3 years planning and implementing the project, creating spaces where young visitors could learn about composting, seed starting, beneficial insects, and water conservation through hands-on activities. "This is Silas's real legacy," said Dr. Patricia Huang, the county's parks director, as she addressed the gathering. "Not just beautiful gardens, but the knowledge and passion he shared with thousands of people over the past decade." When it was his turn to speak, Silas kept his remarks brief. "I've learned that the best gardens are the ones that keep growing after the gardener is gone," he said. "Not just the plants, but the knowledge, the appreciation, and the sense of responsibility for taking care of things." He gestured toward a group of teenagers who'd been working as volunteer docents, leading tours and helping with educational programs. "These young people know more about sustainable gardening than I did when I started here. They'll teach others, who'll teach others, and the gardens will keep growing long after all of us are gone." The applause was warm and sustained. In the audience, Agent Monroe reflected on the remarkable transformation she'd witnessed. The man who'd been detained at an airport 10 years ago for carrying the wrong kind of memories had become a beloved teacher, mentor, and community leader. After the formal program ended, Monroe found herself walking through the gardens with Silas, moving slowly to accommodate his pace. "Any thoughts on the anniversary?" she asked. 10 years ago, I thought my past was something I needed to keep separate from my present," he replied. "I've learned that it's all the same life. The skills I learned in government service, attention to detail, long-term planning, working with difficult people, they're all useful for gardening and teaching. Do you think things worked out the way they were supposed to?" Silas paused beside a bench that overlooked the rose garden he'd planted 20 years earlier. The climbing roses had matured into a spectacular display that drew visitors from across the state. "Agent Monroe, I've learned that supposed to is a dangerous concept. Things work out the way they work out, and then we decide what to make of them." They sat on the bench in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon light filter through the trees that Silas had planted as saplings, and that now provided shade for entire families. "Sir, I have a confession," Monroe said. I've been thinking about what comes next for me. Federal service has been rewarding, but I'm starting to think about other ways to contribute. What kind of other ways? Teaching, maybe. Or working with community organizations, something where I can see the direct impact of the work. Silas smiled. Agent Monroe, the world needs people who understand service and can teach others about responsibility. Whatever you choose to do, you'll do it well. As the sun set over the Whitmore Gardens, they continued their conversation about purpose, legacy, and the many different ways to serve others. Neither of them mentioned the airport incident that had brought them together, but both understood that it had changed their lives in ways they were still discovering. 15 years after the airport incident, the Whitmore Gardens had become one of Virginia's premier educational destinations, hosting over 50,000 visitors annually. Silas Creighton, now 93, had stepped back from daily garden maintenance but continued to live in his apartment above the old carriage house, serving as an advisor and occasional tour guide for visitors with special interests. The gardens themselves had evolved far beyond their original design, incorporating new sections focused on climate change adaptation, pollinator habitat, and food security. The educational program served thousands of students each year, and the volunteer program had grown to include over 200 active participants. Agent Monroe had indeed left federal service, establishing a nonprofit organization that provided security, training, and career transition services for veterans and retired government employees. She visited the gardens regularly, both for personal enjoyment and to bring clients who were struggling with their own transitions from classified work to civilian life. Miles Webb had become chief of police for a small Virginia town, where he was known for his community-oriented approach and his innovative training programs. He still told the story of Silas Creighton in his classes, though he'd never revealed the man's real name or specific background. Mrs. Whitmore had passed away peacefully at age 96, leaving behind a trust fund that ensured the gardens' continued operation and growth. Her final wish was that the gardens continue to serve as a reminder that everyone has the potential to contribute something beautiful to the world. On a warm spring morning, as Silas made his way slowly through the gardens he'd helped create, he encountered a group of school children gathered around the butterfly garden. Their teacher was explaining the life cycle of monarchs, and the children were asking the kinds of direct, enthusiastic questions that had always been his favorite part of educational tours. "Excuse me," one little girl said, approaching Silas, with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you the man who made all these flowers?" Silas smiled, leaning on his walking stick. "I helped plant some of them, but they grew themselves. My teacher says gardens are like books that tell stories. What story does your garden tell?" It was the kind of question that would have stumped him 15 years earlier, when he was still learning to talk about his work without revealing classified information. Now the answer came easily. "It tells the story of people who took care of things," he said. "People who planted seeds they might not live to see fully grown, who made sure beautiful things would be here for others to enjoy." The little girl nodded, seriously, as if this made perfect sense. "Are you going to keep taking care of things?" "As long as I can," Silas replied. "And when I can't anymore, other people will. That's how gardens work. Everyone takes turns being the gardener." As the school group moved on to the next section of their tour, Silas continued his slow walk through the paths he'd helped create. The gardens were full of visitors enjoying the spring flowers, volunteer docents leading tours, and maintenance staff tending to the daily needs of thousands of plants. It was exactly the kind of busy, purposeful, beautiful place he'd hoped to create when he'd first accepted Mrs. Whitmore's job offer 25 years earlier. The work would continue long after he was gone, carried forward by people who understood that the most important service often happens quietly, one day at a time, in places where ordinary people do extraordinary things. In the distance, he could see the rose garden where this phase of his life had begun, now mature enough to require less daily attention, but still producing the spectacular blooms that drew photographers and admirers from around the world. The climbing roses had grown beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd first planted them, reaching heights that seemed impossible for plants that had started as small, vulnerable seedlings. Like everything else he'd learned about gardening, it was also true of life. Given enough time, care, and the right conditions, small beginnings could grow into something magnificent. As Silas settled onto his favorite bench to rest and watch the day's activities, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from classified operations to public gardens, from secrecy to education, from isolation to community. It hadn't been the retirement he'd planned, but it had been exactly the life he'd needed. The story that had begun with a misunderstanding at an airport security checkpoint had become something much larger, a reminder that everyone has hidden depths, that service takes many forms, and that the most lasting contributions to the world are often the ones that grow quietly, season after season, tended by people who understand that the best work is done not for recognition, but for the simple satisfaction of making something beautiful that will outlast them. And in the end, that was the only story that really mattered. This story reminds us that legends walk among us every day, hidden in plain sight, their extraordinary pasts masked by ordinary presence. The next time you encounter someone who seems unremarkable, remember Silas Crichton and consider the possibility that you might be in the presence of greatness. What struck you most about Silas's journey from classified operative to beloved gardener? Have you ever completely misjudged someone, only to discover their hidden depths? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If this tale of hidden heroism and second chances moved you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story that celebrates the extraordinary people living ordinary lives all around us. Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery.